All right, ladies and gentlemen, in this presentation we're going to talk about some special organelles inside the cell and the chemical processes that those organelles are involved in. So the first organelle that I want to discuss is the chloroplast. All right. Now the chloroplast is a very special organelle. It's actually only found in plant cells and some microorganisms. It is typically responsible for making organisms appear green, and it is the site inside of a cell that photosynthesis happens. It also is what holds a cell's chlorophyll. So chloroplasts have a very unique structure. First off, they have a double membrane structure, and you can see that on this diagram how it says outer membrane and inner membrane. There's actually two membranes that surround a chloroplast, not just one. And that is a byproduct of evolution. We actually believe that at some point a large organism swallowed a chloroplast but didn't digest it, and then they started to have a symbiotic relationship. And so one of the remnants of that is the double membrane that they have. Chloroplasts also have inside of them these little discs, and you can see them right here. And these discs are known as thylakoids. Thylakoids are the site of the light reactions of photosynthesis. So it is in the thylakoids that the thylakoids, like I said, are the site of the light reactions of photosynthesis. And the thylakoids are actually stored in these stacks. All right, they look almost like a stack of pancakes. I like to think of them as like one of those coin roll-up things where you put all the coins in that sleeve. And we call those stacks granum. All right. Now, the other key aspect of the chloroplast is the fluid outside the thylakoids. And that fluid is called the stroma. And it is in this fluid that the dark reactions of photosynthesis take place. So that's the basic structure of the chloroplast and where different aspects happen. So why don't we talk a little bit about photosynthesis, so like saying things like light reaction and dark reaction actually makes sense. So basically what happens is this. Plants are able to absorb light. The chemicals that absorb light are actually called pigments, and the most common pigment is known as chlorophyll. Chlorophyll actually absorbs every color but green. It does not absorb green. People generally assume it does, like, oh, it's green, it must absorb green, but it doesn't work that way. You actually appear to be the color of the wavelengths of light that you reflect. So chlorophyll absorbs other colors, but not green. So what happens is this light gets absorbed in chlorophyll, and a series of chemical reactions known as the light reactions happen. And the light reactions actually make some ATP that is used to make sugar. And they make some other chemicals that are used to generate sugar. One among them is this thing called NADPH. Now, these chemicals that the light reaction makes actually enter this thing called the Calvin cycle, which is also known as the dark reactions. Okay, so the Calvin cycle is the dark reactions. And the Calvin cycle takes these chemicals that the light reaction makes, takes this energy that the light reaction makes, and it makes a precursor to sugar. Now, this precursor can actually become sugar. It can become lipids. It can become proteins. It's a chemical that plants can basically turn into whatever they need, but most regularly it's turned into sugar, which is stored and used for respiration. It's commonly misunderstood. Plants actually undergo the process of respiration. They are designed to use the sugar they store. It's just that plants store more sugar than they'll use, which is why we can steal it. And plants also sometimes store sugar in structures that are meant to spread their seeds throughout the environment, which is why we have things like fruit and vegetables. All right. So photosynthesis is basically broken down into two parts. The first one is the light reaction, which is dependent on light. And the second one, which is the Calvin cycle, doesn't actually need light, and so we call it the dark reaction, but it does need the light reaction to have happened. All right? One reaction feeds into the next, but the two of them together are the process of photosynthesis. Next up, what I want to do is talk about the mitochondria. Mitochondria is totally my favorite organelle. All right. So the mitochondria is very similar to the chloroplast. The mitochondria has two membranes, an outer membrane and an inner membrane. Again, because the mitochondria is a result of what we call the endosymbiotic theory. At some point in the history of life, a larger cell tried to swallow a smaller cell, and it did, but it couldn't digest it. The result eventually became the mitochondria, which is the powerhouse of the cell. So mitochondria undergo the process of respiration. All right, so mitochondria are responsible for cellular respiration. To accomplish that, they have two sections. The first section is known as the cristae, and the cristae are folds in the inner membrane. And these folds increase surface area for transport. And then you also have the matrix, which is the fluid-filled center. And that actually is a location for one of the steps to cellular respiration. So again, with the mitochondria, just like the chloroplast, we have these structures like the cristae and the matrix that actually allow the mitochondria to complete its job. So here you have an overview of cellular respiration. So here I have the mitochondria. And cellular respiration is basically broken into three parts. The first part is glycolysis. Lysis means to break. So glycolysis is actually breaking glucose. And you'll notice here that glycolysis gives ATP. Not a lot, but it does give us some. And the products of glycolysis end up in our second step, which is known as the Krebs cycle. Now the Krebs cycle gives us, again, some ATP. And the Krebs cycle is carried out in the matrix. Now the Krebs cycle uses the products of glycolysis and creates new products. Some of it's ATP, some of it ends up in this structure known as the electron transport chain. And the electron transport chain generates most of the ATP. All right, the vast majority of ATP that's generated by breaking down glucose comes from the electron transport chain. Now, the electron transport chain is really important because it happens on the cristae. So without the cristae, there's nowhere for the electron transport chain to happen. And it requires oxygen. So if you don't have oxygen gas, the electron transport chain stops. And in fact, when it stops, it backs the whole system up, and glycolysis goes to either lactic acid fermentation or just regular fermentation, depending on the organism. All right, so this is aerobic, meaning when there's no oxygen. But it specifically is the electron transport chain that requires the oxygen. And it is this electron transport chain that generates the majority of the ATP in cells. So, real quick, one last thing. In both mitochondria and chloroplast, there's a very similar system set up. There's obviously slight variations because of, chloroplast using light energy, mitochondria using energy that's been stored in the chemical bonds of glucose, but they're very similar in what they do. This right here is an electron. And that electron contains energy. Again, that energy could be from light, or that energy could be from the chemical energy stored in glucose. And that electron basically gets played like hot potato, and it passes from molecule to molecule to molecule, and then into oxygen gas. That's why you need oxygen gas. As this electron is passed from molecule to molecule in this microscopic game of hot potato, hydrogen atoms, ions rather, are moved from one side of a membrane to another. And what this does is this creates a concentration gradient. And these hydrogen atoms then flow through this membrane-bound protein that's a transport protein, and them actually flowing through this down the concentration gradient takes ADP and a phosphate ion, connects them, and that's what generates the ATP. So this process of cellular respiration, this process of photosynthesis, actually uses active transport, which is what's going on here, to transport hydrogen ions against the gradient, and then it uses facilitated diffusion to allow the hydrogen ions to then flow back down the gradient, and that facilitated diffusion actually also creates ATP molecules. And so that's sort of how cellular transport and membranes and the process of photosynthesis and respiration connect. All right, so there's some specialized functions of cells.